Yeah, thank you very much for staying tuned to Development Focus with Didi Ojo on ITV. It's a privilege and honor to facilitate this show. And like I told us earlier, this show is open to advert and sponsorship. It's open to sponsorship and advert placement. You can come do business with us on this show. My second guest on is unavoidably absent in the studio because of a technical itch, and we decided to go live with him via telephone. Samson Istodo is online. Good morning, Samson.
Good morning, and apologies for not making it to the studio this morning.
It's all right. It does happen. It's one of those things about life. Life is so unpredictable. But it's good that you are safe and you are okay. Something Yaga Africa has been doing a lot in the electoral circle. Did you see this happening when you started some 13, 14 years ago?
Well, actually, next week we'll make it 15 years since Yaga was established.
15 years.
And we owe it to people like you who have held our hands right from when we started and up till date. Did we see this coming? Our vision, was to build a people-driven, democratic, and developed Africa, and we've kept faith with that vision. And again, to also say, thanks to people like you who supported us, who provided the mentorship.
Anyway, let's thank God.
Different stages of our advancement, and so we're glad that we're able to make the little impact that we make.
Okay, I think for many Nigerians, the most memorable thing Young African has done is the Not Too Young to Run bill advocacy, which took place 2017-2018, which succeeded in the alteration of the constitutional provision, reducing the age qualification for president and State House of Assembly. How did you develop that brainwave as to think that one of the challenges that Nigerian youth face is age qualification for such positions?
Well, there are several challenges that impede on the youth participation, and I also want to emphasize that democracy is about participation. That when you limit participation to a certain group of people, democracy loses its vitality. And just informed by our own notion and conception of democracy, we thought that we could address one of the problems that impedes on youth participation, and that is the age criteria for running for public office. Previously, we had a constitution that excluded young people, and old politicians were recycling themselves in public office. And if you check the state of governance in the country, you see how, our political leaders have destroyed and fractured the relationship between state and society. And young people wanted to make a difference by joining in the fray of politics and just to fix our governance and leadership problem. But one of the challenges that stopped them was the provisions for age qualification. Of course, there's also the cost of politics and internal democracy. We're mindful of this, but we just took on one of the issues, which was the age qualification, and said if we reduce the age qualification, it might open the space for young people to get involved, but also raise their consciousness around political participation and its value, to sustainable livelihoods as well as improved governance. And that's what informed the Not Too Young to Run campaign, which was actually a 10-year struggle before we got the Constitution amended at that critical time. And since then, we've seen young people who are between 25 and 30, sit at the state who contest elections and won elections in 2019. We also see more younger people are getting interested in running for office. And we're very glad that we're able to catalyze that, working with other young people and also an older generation that cares about leadership or political transition.
So, Samson, when you got a call from the presidency to come for the signing ceremony, I recall it was May 31, 2018, yes, that the president signed a Not Too Young to Run bill into law, a constitutional amendment of no mean feat. He signed that, he singled out that for his assent before he now signed 4 others at a later date. When you got that call, what runs through your mind? What feelings or emotions did you have having to be invited to Aso Rock to meet with the president and have a photo op with him as he signs the Not Too Young to Run bill?
There were 2 outstanding feelings. One was a feeling of hope, and second was a feeling of I was humbled by what we had achieved over the years. What do I mean by hope? Here is a country where people believe your father or your parents must be wealthy, they must be affluent, and you must have political connections to make change happen. Here is a country where people had lost faith in democracy, that political leaders would not listen to people. Here is a country where, citizens have become so disengaged, and the distrust within the political space is so deep and wide. And that gave me hope, and hope because the Not Too Young to Run that we celebrate today was a product of a struggle led by young people. I could see democracy and democratic accountability at play, where young people, in their communities, in the grassroots, like we call it, were picking up their phones, they were texting their legislators and asking them to vote yes to Not Too Young to Run. In fact, in a particular case, we saw young people actually, pressuring their legislators and telling them if they don't vote for the Not Too Young to Run bill, they were going to be voted out of office. That's the level of political consciousness that we want to see, where politicians know that there is consequence for non-performance. And that gave me a lot of hope, and all of us who were part of this struggle. The second feeling was just the feeling of humility, that yes, as a generation, we have altered, the narrative and the political history of our country. And we've seen how, that space has shifted, the conversation shifted. Governors were beginning to compete amongst themselves as to who has the highest number of young people in their cabinet, or states began to compete within themselves. But what is critical was that an opportunity was presented for young people, that yes, regardless of our challenges, our leadership challenges, and the state of our development, that here is an opportunity for young people to begin to contribute. Not like they've not been contributing before, but this is a time to up the ante with our participation. And what was also critical was the fact that for young people who had the competence, who had the character, and who had the capacity, an opportunity was presented for them. So for me, it was just a sense of humility that we as a generation have made an impact within our governance and democratic process. Yes, it may happen because it happened a year before the elections. Yeah, it might be a huge political moment or policy moment, but I think beyond that is the fact that it gave hope and reassurance to Nigerian youth that they can actually make change happen amidst the confusion, the disillusionment, and the disenchantment that has pervaded our political life.
So, arising from the Not Too Young to Run, I heard it somewhere that about 300 Nigerian youths were elected into different political offices in 2019. 19. Correct me if I'm wrong. And amongst them, 4 or 5 of them emerge as speakers of their state houses of assembly. How true is that?
Yeah, so post the 2019, we looked at how many young people, and young people in this case, we look at between 18 and 35. That was the benchmark that we used. And for the State House of Assembly elections, we had young people, about 103 young people who won the elections into State House of Assembly between 18 and 35.
Okay.
Out of that figure, 20 of them were between 25 and 29.
Wow.
And those are the first beneficiaries of the Not Too Young to Run, because the Not Too Young to Run bill or act reduced the age for running for State House of Assembly from 30 to 25. So some of them were 25, some of them were 26 when they ran and they won, and they are current members of the State House of Assembly. If you come to the National Assembly, where the age was also reduced to 25, but between 18 and 35, about 13 members
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
There are about 13 members of the Federal House of Reps who were between that age as at 2019. So the entire figure, it's not up to 300, maybe, except if we look at local governments, but we didn't capture that. But we looked at the federal, all the elections conducted by INEC. The average youth representation rate within the country was about 6.6%. So youth representation in elective office, excluding local councils, is about 6.6%. And as at 2015, it was just at about 5%. So it only increased with about 1.something%, but we didn't have up to 300. But if you look at the candidacy before the elections, we had in 2015 the youth candidacy, and candidacy will be young people who were presented as candidates in the 2015 elections. The percentage was about 28%, but in 2019 it moved to about 34.9%. So we see this incremental progress that we make, and our projection is that by 2023 we would also see a surge in the number of young people who are presented as candidates.
Okay, so Samson, let's come to the brass tack. Issue of anti-corruption in the electoral value chain. Walk us through, what are those, between theory and practice, what does the law say? We have Electoral Act provisions that criminalize vote buying, vote trading, Section 124, Section 130. We have INEC saying, don't bring your smartphones into the polling unit so that you don't take pictures to go and collect money from party agents. And if you look at the 3 phases of the electoral cycle, walk us through what are those anti-corruption measures that we have, either in the law or in the guidelines for conducting elections. Let's look at that first before we now look at the practice as observed by YAGA Africa Watching the Vote during the various election observation missions.
Well, if you look at the entire spectrum of our electoral process, you'll see that most 90% of our laws and rules can be considered as anti-corruption mechanism, because they try to protect the sanctity of the votes and also secure, voting materials and prevent suppression of the electoral process. So I will consider all the regulations as actually an anti-corruption measure. And let me just highlight 3. So what I call the dominants. The first is, if you look at the voter registration process. Now, every voter is expected to register once, only once, and you're entitled to one permanent voter's card, and you can only vote once. In the voter registration process, we've seen cases where people actually register multiple times. People have multiple PVCs in their possession. Sometimes they make attempts, to vote more than once. The introduction of the smart card reader, or the BVAS, is an anti-corruption measure aimed at limiting, the overvoting or voting by proxy that is criminal. So this innovation seeks to sanitize that entire process, so people cannot register more than once. Currently, if you check the amount of multiple registrants, people who registered more than once, the figure is quite high. So it's disturbing. And what the law actually says, it provides, gives INEC prosecutorial powers to prosecute people who register more than once, because it's an electoral offense. The second, and you talked about it, it's about vote buying. And one of the regulations INEC introduced in 2019 or before 2019 and subsequent elections, it says voters should not go into the polling booth with their phones. And why is this important? Because in the value chain of vote buying, one of the things that voters do, they take pictures and they use those pictures to show as evidence how they have voted, to claim the rewards that politicians give to them. And that's really one mechanism. The third one, and also very critical when you look at an anti-corruption measure, the guidelines are very clear as to how the powers, that collation officers during elections have. And it provides, the levels of, collation of results, that when results move from the polling unit, it goes to the wards, and from the wards, it goes to the local government. Now, these processes that are broken down are geared towards providing spaces for people to participate and monitor and follow how the results collation is transmitted. And the law also provides that those results must be recorded in particular forms. Now, what we've seen, local level, is sometimes, the collation officers decide to collate the results at a different location, or they don't collect the results using the prescribed forms, or even when they do, they mutilate the results or use, fake result sheets at that micro level. Now, that is at variance with the provisions of the guidelines, because the guideline says, you must declare, for instance, for a returning officer, if you're declaring in for a senatorial election, you must declare it at the local government of that senatorial district. And if you look at the 2019, one of the things that happened with, one of the elections in Abia, involving a current sitting senator, the results were declared at a different location other than the one prescribed in the guidelines. And why was that? Because the politician conspired with the returning officer. But the guidelines is clear, as to the location where this should happen. And why is that location important? Because INEC has control, and there is security, and there is transparency. So that helps in protecting and safeguarding the process from compromise. So these are some of the issues within the electoral process. If you want to check even the candidate nomination process, like primaries, where INEC says parties must submit their list of delegates to INEC. Why is this important? So INEC can monitor the primaries and ensure that the process is not compromised, that people eligible delegates are the ones voting at those congresses or those primaries. We know how delegates lists are being changed and substituted. Sometimes you hear fake fake delegate lists. All of these are just indicators of corruption within the political process.
So Samson, we have a minute to rounding up. The Electoral Act 2020, Electoral Bill 2022 that is expected to be signed into law. Some people have also said that the issue of electronic transmission of results is an anti-corruption measure. Do you agree with that? And is there any other provisions in this new law that we are expecting that will aid transparency and integrity of our electoral process?
The electronic transmission of results is an anti-corruption measure that should be supported, and we strongly support that. The other provision within the law that vests INEC with the power to review results have either been falsified or have been declared in contravention or without compliance with the law is also another anti-corruption measure. In fact, even granting INEC financial autonomy is an anti-corruption measure, because one way to rig the elections or rig elections is for the government to starve INEC of the funding that it requires, to conduct elections. If there is no funding, INEC cannot procure beavers, INEC cannot pay its staff, INEC cannot also procure materials for the elections. And so what happens is when a budget has been provided and then the releases are not made to INEC deliberately to undermine the Electoral Commission. So these are these are provisions within the Electoral Bill that that will stop and limit the corrupt practices within our electoral process. Because once you increase transparency, you limit the incidence of corruption. And we urge the president and citizens should call on the president to assent to this bill within the next 1 week, so we can commence full preparations for the 2023 elections.
I want to thank you very much, Samson Itodo, Executive Director, Yiaga Africa, for coming on the show. I really do appreciate, despite the inconvenience that you are going through, that you still was able to talk to us on this show. I wish you all the best and happy celebration, happy 50th anniversary of Yiaga Africa as it comes up in a week's time. Please do stay safe and stay blessed. That will be the size of our show this morning. If you've enjoyed this show, please tune in this same time next week as we bring a fresh edition to your viewing pleasure. Do stay safe and stay blessed. Bye for now.